Let's start off with probably a precursor to an event that Renaissance Capital is hosting next week. We have Renaissance hosting a Pan-African conference. Give us a brief overview of what exactly that's about.
Yes, good afternoon, Alicia, and thanks for having me. We have a sub-Saharan conference in Lagos next week. Essentially what we're doing is we bring in 200 investors and corporates together in a one-on-one environment, giving investors from across the continent and in fact across the world the chance to spend some time with management at a top level, CEOs and CFOs of sub-Saharan African companies in a one-on-one private environment. Alongside that, we also have some panel discussions, and we have a pre-IPO day on the last day of the conference. So really what it is bringing together investors, sources of capital from across the globe and the continent with corporates.
Already we've seen South Africa becoming a member of BRICS, and that certainly directing a fair share of attention our way. As an emerging markets investment bank, how do you see South Africa and by extension the rest of Africa fitting into this entire emerging market scenario from an investment perspective?
Alicia, I think this is, I think that's a good question, and I think what's happening is the investor base globally, this is not just the Asian investor base looking at commodities in Africa, the investor base globally are becoming more and more comfortable with Africa as a whole, not just South Africa but sub-Sahara. There's more stability. You see more democratic elections across the continent. There's far better corporate governance across the continent, and I think that gives people a sense of comfort. So I think that's really a big theme in this in the attraction of capital flows from both Asia and from the rest of the developed world.
So it's one thing that being the sentiment that's out there, Clifford. To what extent is this actually being reflected in the kind of deal flow we're seeing?
Well, we've seen all sorts of flows. We've seen capital flows into listed equities across the continent, and that really is at significant levels. We're also seeing some pretty interesting themes, and I'll give you an example of this. We recently advised a sizable Asian corporate on a significant investment in Zimbabwe. In fact, I think it's this comprises the biggest investment into Zimbabwe pre or post independence, a little over $700 million. And this was a big Asian corporate investing in a local steel mill. They are going to be bringing technology, they're going to be creating jobs. And I think that's a theme, a fixed investment theme that you're starting to see play out in geographies that some people consider to be risky. And certainly this for us was a landmark and groundbreaking transaction in a very, very important geography, Zimbabwe specifically.
It's certainly interesting that you touch on that geography when citing an example, because I mean we're looking when it comes to this deal at privatization coming to the fore, and that almost at odds with what we've seen emerge out of Zimbabwe, where there's so much talk about indigenization. So to what extent does that still pose a challenge?
Well, again, I think that's a good point, but it shows you that a lot of the press and the PR that you see doesn't necessarily translate into what's going on the ground. So without getting into any real specifics on this one, this is a major Asian investor that's made a significant investment in Zimbabwe and has taken comfort, frankly, from their conversations with government and from other corporates on the ground. And I think I'd rather not go into too much detail on the indigenization issue, but suffice it to say this transaction will close shortly.
How difficult, though, Clifford, does something like that make your job in terms of encouraging investors to look this way?
Well, again, I think this is a landmark transaction in a geography that a lot of people consider to be quite risky and difficult to do business in. I think what's probably interesting here is, we're on the ground in 6 countries now in Africa. We're in Zimbabwe, Zambia, obviously South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, and Ghana. And I think when you've got on-the-ground expertise, you're able to offer slightly more effective and probably better advice to multinationals wanting to come in.
Yeah.
So, I think the Renaissance theme of making investments, local investments, and getting to understand those landscapes probably pays off.
Of course, you touched on the fact that there will be pre-IPO companies involved in this networking session over in Nigeria next week. What kind of investor appetite is out there for state-owned enterprises that are looking at going down this privatization route? And I'm speaking generally across the board on Africa.
There's a tremendous amount of interest, and I think much of this is thematic. You know, if you just think about the challenges that Africa faces, specifically, perhaps one example is power. I think you're going to see a lot of PPPs in the power sector across this continent. You've got a huge demand and almost insatiable appetite for power across the continent. There's a massive amount of natural wealth, both oil and gas and other sources of energy. There's a huge amount of capital chasing all those opportunities, and that's all starting to come together now across both East and West Africa.
Taking a look at some of the sectors that are gaining attention, you mentioned earlier or just touched on the fact that, we are seeing a move away from a focus on just a commodity-based space and looking at more of the other sectors. And amongst those sectors, the consumer goods, the fast-moving consumer goods sector really comes into the spotlight. To what extent are you seeing attention diverted that way?
Well, you've got a massive consumer base in Africa. You've got just almost 1 billion people now across this continent. Standards of living are rising fast, and that obviously feeds into the consumer story. But the other story is that we are strong believers in is the agricultural one. Mm-hmm. If you think about this for a moment, Africa is home to 60% of the uncultivated arable land in the world at the moment. So food shortages everywhere. Africa has a massive resource of uncultivated arable land right now, and that's going to be brought to production. That's going to require capital and investment. That is a huge theme.